like holding a man underwater and saying, why don't you swim? It's pretty hard to swim if you're being held underwater, or it's shackling a fellow to a post and saying, why don't you run? In other words, we have created a kind of social situation where discrimination bears upon a person because of his color 1,000 times a day. He can't do this, he can't do that. He's lacked many things that we take for granted, or our youngsters take for granted. And therefore, you cannot put all these inhibitions around a person and then say, why don't you try harder? What we have to do is create what this country has stood for everyone, is equality of opportunity. Now, what happens after that, of course, is an individual's own personal responsibility, but not to have equality of opportunity, then to blame someone for not performing better is putting the cart before the horse.
Please welcome engineer and civil rights activist Sonnie Hereford from the class of 1979.
Good afternoon. Anybody else here from the class of 79? A few of us? Okay, wonderful. Well, Father Ted worked for decades on human rights issues, including civil rights issues. He understood that some members of society face challenges that are not necessarily faced by all members of society. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama, where we have Redstone Arsenal and NASA, George C. Marshall Space Flight Center for NASA. So, of course, we have a lot of federal contracts there. And one of the discussions I've had with a lot of my coworkers and friends over the years is about set-asides for minorities, and or quotas for minorities. And what Father Ted understood was that some members of our society are at a disadvantage as a direct result of the actions of the federal government, and therefore the federal government has tried to do some things to make those right. Okay. As far as my own story goes, that's me, the little guy there. When I was 6 years old, I was the first black child to integrate the schools in the state of Alabama in 1963. Now, my father actually had to file a lawsuit to get me to be able to go to the all-white school that was about a block and a half from our home. The all-black school for the city of Huntsville was about a mile and a half from our home. So we had to go to court against the Huntsville City Schools. Now, this was 9 years, 1963 was 9 years after Brown versus Board of Education, which struck down separate but equal, or so we thought. But that didn't mean that Alabama or other places, especially in the South, automatically got in line. It took some brave people, it took some courage, some sacrifice, and court challenges to be able to make things happen. Now, the lawyers for Huntsville City Schools tried everything to keep me out of the school. They had very little to stand on. Like I said, Brown versus Board was 9 years old. But they had a 4-point argument in court, in federal court, why I should not be able to go to the school. Their first point was that such a thing had never been done before. Okay? Of course, the judge dismissed that. Their second point was that there was such a wide street that I would have to cross to get to the, so I guess they were concerned for my safety. I don't know. But the judge asked their lawyers, he said, well, are there white children that have to cross that street? Yes. Are there crossing guards to help those white children? Yes. Can't those same crossing guards help him to cross the street? So they had lost that argument. Their third point was that if they let this one little Negro boy, as they said, go to that school, it would disrupt the entire school system. And the way my father described it, he said, the judge leaned forward and he said, you mean to tell me you have such poor control of your school system that this one little boy could disrupt the entire system? Well, there's no good answer to that question. You can't say yes, you can't say no, right? And their fourth point was that they had turned Montgomery, Alabama upside down and could not find a trace of my birth certificate. So if you think when they tried that with Barack Obama, if you think that was the first time, it was not. Now, I suspect that their lawyers were a little bit embarrassed when our lawyers explained that I was born in East Chicago, Indiana, and they needed to be looking in Indianapolis. for that birth certificate. But anyway, the judge, after hearing both sides, ruled from the bench, did not even retire to deliberate. He said, admit this student immediately, and he said, by January 1st, I want to plan on my desk for the desegregation of all Huntsville City and Madison County schools. And so that was the end of that. But that just gives you one example of the challenges that black people faced as far as education. My father, who was born in 1931, never went to a school with adequate facilities. He had to mail order a chemistry set to teach himself about chemistry because his high school just wasn't equipped to do that. He mail ordered a set and taught himself chemistry because he wanted to be a doctor. But again, that's another example of the challenges. Now, as far as housing goes, there was a fairly nice apartment complex in our town that was suspected of discriminating based on race. And so a test was set up. A black gentleman went in late in the morning with a pretty good background, pretty good credentials, pretty good credit history, all of that stuff, and was told that there were no apartments to rent. A white gentleman went in early in the afternoon, and they had 3 places to show him. Very similar background, but they had 3 places. So that's another example of the kinds of challenges that have been faced. As far as employment, my father started his medical career in 1956. He had to practice in a segregated hospital. He was not allowed to use the cafeteria in the hospital. He was not allowed to be a formal member of the staff, and after he petitioned to be added to the hospital staff, he was not allowed to vote on anything at the meetings. And, if I had more time, I could go through a lot of other examples, but you start to get some idea of the way things were. The schools were segregated, of course. The stores were segregated. The public facilities had separate restrooms, separate water fountains, and those kinds of things. But those were the challenges that we faced. Now, fast forward to 1974. I was a junior in high school. I was president-elect of the student body. 1974 was the 20th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, and I was invited to New York City to participate in the NAACP celebration. I met a fellow there named Howard Glickstein, who took the message back to Father Hesburgh that even though I was getting ready to be a senior, I wanted to come to Notre Dame. Well, a week or two later, I got a letter from Father Ted inviting me to apply to Notre Dame. So I felt like the skids were adequately greased. I didn't even apply anyplace else, and if I hadn't gotten in, I'm not sure what I would have done after that. But now, if I can fast forward to 2013. Now, 2013 was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and there was a celebration in Washington, D.C. called the March on Washington Film Festival. Thank you. And there I am with Congressman John Lewis, who I think is the greatest living civil rights icon that there is. And I'm very proud of this picture because we were the only two members of the panel on a discussion about race relations then and now. Oh, okay. I thought that was my cue to get off or something. Anyway, race relations then and now. And I had just made a point about Antonin Scalia, who at that point was on the Supreme Court. And this is Congressman Lewis telling me and telling the audience that he had been in California the week before this event. He had tried to make that same point, but hadn't made it as well as I did. So I'm very proud of that picture. And the last thing I want to say is that I know that Father Ted is watching us. When I was in first grade, and I was the only black child in the school, and we had the cafeteria where you have the stack of trays. You take your tray down, slide it along the rail, and so forth. Well, there was a little girl in line next to me. She wasn't quite tall enough to get her tray down, and I got her tray down and went to hand it to her. And she said, "Oh, no, my mother told me never to take anything from a nigger." And as you can imagine, that could have been a very, very negative thing. But to me, what I took from that was that she didn't even know what she was saying. And I've taken that with me all these years, that children that young don't know that they should have that kind of bigotry in their hearts. And so I would leave you with the idea, please don't ever be one who spreads or even lets that kind of bigotry go. Please make sure that you eradicate that. And thank you very much for being here.